Years ago, there was a case in a hospital, Celia Farber wrote about it, where a 2-year-old baby tested positive for HIV. And the hospital there, as many clinics around the world, even today, have the policy that if there's an open wound where you have blood, then you get tested for HIV. And the toddler had an open wound on the head, and so, as was the policy of the hospital, they tested the baby for HIV. The baby came out positive. The hospital claimed that the baby must have been raped. Social services got involved, but in this case there was pushback from the parents, and they threatened a lawsuit, and the hospital backtracked, and they came out and they issued a statement. I think they gave a press conference saying that no, this was a false positive test. It's interesting how they arrived at the conclusion that this test must have been a false positive. It wasn't by going through the antibodies and collecting again and saying, no, we added up the antibodies wrong. No, they made the claim that the baby didn't have the circumstances to have contacted HIV, and for that reason, it must have been a false positive, because there was no way that the baby could have contracted HIV, so it must have been a false positive. Now, how many people that test positive for HIV could also make that argument that it was a false positive based on not having the circumstances to have caught HIV? There was pushback from the parents, and the hospital backtracked. But it's interesting the argument they made for how you know that something is a false positive. Because look at all the pregnant women who test positive. Pregnant women test positive because in many places around the world, clinics and hospitals have the policy that when a woman is pregnant, you test them for HIV. And even if a woman is she's only had one partner, she's a housewife, let's say, she can always claim, well, my husband must have been sleeping around and must have given me HIV. Because you can always blame somebody else. But if these false positive tests can be for people whose circumstances don't make them part of any risk group, then what about those who test positive and that do have a so-called risk behavior? How would you know even if they were a false positive or not? Or people who have symptoms of one of the 30 plus HIV defining diseases, pneumonia, tuberculosis, whatever. Because if the idea is, well, you got the test, but then you've also got the symptoms, you're also part of a risk group, and so these things corroborate it, but that's not scientific. We'll never know how many people are really positive according to the tests in the world, because they don't do random testing. I'm not suggesting they do, but if they did, we would be very surprised. And we find that children, probably a lot of them, would test positive for HIV precisely because of the antibodies they're given to them through vaccination campaigns. So there's never even been offered by the World Health Organization a standardized criteria for how to interpret these HIV tests. And there's great variation from one country to the next, even from one clinic to the next. I had a woman, I'll never forget it, she wrote to me and she said, in Argentina, I'm HIV positive. But with the same test in Brazil, I would be negative because of the different ways they interpret the tests. And when you test positive for HIV, a whole set of legal criteria set in, and you can be, many people are discriminated against, especially if a person that tests positive for HIV, an adult, they want to say, no, this is bogus, I'm not going to follow these protocols, I'm not going to take medication. If you're a woman, I'm not going to have a cesarean section and commit not to breastfeed my baby. So there's a lot of risk involved in just taking the test because of all the legal protocols that kick in for somebody that's HIV positive, including a sexual intercourse being assault with a deadly weapon or an attempt to murder. And there are people who have actually gone to jail for that. So, but it's interesting in this case of the baby, because if the parents didn't push back, they could have lost the baby, because the hospital was saying, well, there's no other way that the baby could have gotten HIV, so the baby must have been raped. So something to think about. What is a false positive with the HIV test? I think that 100% of the HIV tests are false positive. That's my opinion. But even looking at it from within the framework of the official count and looking at it from the framework of the claims that are made with the tests, it's almost worse if you believe the official count at face value, because when we get glimpses of the real numbers, and when we get glimpses like this of the real numbers, it's not 40 million worldwide who have HIV. It's probably more than 200 million. And this would certainly challenge our ideas about the transmissibility of the virus. We would get glimpses of segments across the population that have HIV, according to the tests. So the whole thing is a house of cards. It's totally bogus.